In this video, we're going to talk about the 5 or 6 things that I really like about this new camera, this A7R5, and we'll talk about maybe some of the shortcomings, and I'll really compare this in terms of what the A7R5 does differently as opposed to the A7 IV. The A7R5 is an awesome camera. So not only is it great for stills, but it's also great for video. It's got all the features that you would expect in a high-end camera, similar to like an A1, which I don't have, but I do have the A7 IV. And one of the things that was driving me nuts about the A7 IV is I was using it primarily for photography. And one of the issues was the screen itself. So a fully articulating screen, I think there are some people for sure that have no problem using that for photography situations, but I always like to keep my screen in line with the lens itself. Having the ability to tilt this out as opposed to having to flip it out is a big deal for like everyday use. So I am absolutely thrilled with the screen on this. And then the other things about the screen itself is that not only does it move in such a way that makes it easier to get any type of shot that you can imagine, but in addition to that, it is a much brighter screen than what you would find in the A7 IV. That statement is incorrect. What I wanted to do was set these two up side by side and just double check. And you can see on the right hand side is the A7 IV and on the left hand side is the A7R5. You can see the screen is a little bit larger on the A7R5 and that's nice. But in terms of brightness, they are essentially the same. In fact, the A7 IV is just a smidge brighter than the A7R5. And the reason I know that is because I'm actually testing it out here on the FX3. So I've got these set up for spot metering, and I've got my focus point on the A7R5 right now, but you can see right now it's at, if you look at the the multimeter reading, on the bottom it's 0.0 on the A7R5 screen. If I move this over to the A7 IV screen, it's showing that I'm 1/3 of a stop overexposed. So that means that that screen is just a little bit brighter than the A7R5. That is not what I was expecting when I started this test, but I am pleasantly surprised. So the A7 IV, yes, the screen is just a tad bit brighter, but in terms of actual real world use, you will never see the difference between the two in terms of brightness, but you will see the difference in terms of resolution, with the A7R5 screen being much clearer and easier to read when you are out using the camera. All right, let's talk about some other things that I'm really enjoying on this A7R5. For video, I found the best way to shoot on this camera is 4K 60p. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think part of it is, you know, when you're shooting 4K 60, it's got like a 1.2 something times crop, and then you throw on the active stable on top of that, and that's like another 1.14 times crop. So it's roughly 1.5 times crop that you get with shooting 4K 60, which I really don't mind. I've got wide enough lenses. I've got a Sigma 16-28, and I've also got the Sony 20mm. So between those two lenses, I've got like the wide angle covered. So if I need some stabilization in the footage, I can very easily do that. Yeah, so anyways, the 4K 60 footage just looks awesome coming out of this camera. The 4K 30p, which is typically what I film in, and that's what I'm filming this video in right now, it does look better on the A7 IV and the FX3 as opposed to this camera, but I don't know, you really got to pixel peep in order to see the difference. Like if you're just watching it on YouTube, there's tons of compression on YouTube anyway, so you're really not going to notice a difference. Let's talk about stabilization. So this is a big one. So this claims that this is 8 stops of stabilization. My initial experience with this is that that is probably pretty accurate. I've taken some very slow shutter speeds. Like I've used this lens. In fact, there's a couple of lenses that really I think there's a couple of lenses that you need in order to take advantage of the 8 stops of stabilization. This is one of them. This is the 24-105 f4 lens. I also have the 70-200 GM2. That's another one. So this 24-105 is working incredible with this camera body, this A7R5. So I can zoom it all the way out to like 105 and do 1/5 of a second handheld, no problem whatsoever.
Let's take a look at this epic photo of Bounty paper towels from my basement taken at 1/5 of a second using the 24-105. I'm going to zoom in to 100%. Heck, we'll even make it full screen. And you can see here the Text up on the right-hand side is also quite clear, as is the packaging itself. So this was again taken at f7.1 ISO 100, and you can see it's the full resolution, the 9504, 61 megapixels. So it is the camera in all of its glory, showing off these beautiful Bounty paper towels.
It's nuts. Like, it's crazy when you think about what 8 stops actually means. For moving subjects, it doesn't make a lick of difference, obviously, because you need the higher shutter speeds. But for still scenes, like architecture or just nighttime photography, you may have some moving objects, but you don't really care about those so much. So having the ability to get the shot with a slower shutter speed is really, really great. Now, in addition to that, the stabilization also works really, really well in video mode. So I'll put up on the screen here my kids' indoor track meet from the other day. And this was all handheld. I didn't have it on a monopod. I literally was just holding it to my eye like this, just tracking her and her teammates, around the track. And you can just see in that footage that it's absolutely fine. The stabilization is good. It's very good. It's much better than the results that I saw out of my A7 IV using this exact same lens from a couple of weeks ago. So I am really impressed with the stabilization, and it's certainly a worthwhile upgrade on this particular camera. By the way, if you're enjoying this type of content, maybe give it a like, hit the subscribe button. It really helps out the channel, and it lets me know that this is the type of content that really resonates with viewers of this channel. All right, next I want to talk about the photos. So photos, I found I don't need the 61 megapixels of that this camera affords. Occasionally, I guess I'll use it if I'm shooting something that is like really a lot of detail and you just want that extra resolution. But for the most part, I'm going to be shooting this in the raw medium format, which gives me a 26 megapixel image, which is more than enough for the work that I do.
Here's a quick example of what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about the full frame APS-C mode versus the actual 61 megapixel sensor. So on the left-hand side, you can see here, this is the 61 megapixel 9504 by 6336 resolution. And over on the right-hand side is that same scene shot with the same lens, but I shot it in the raw medium format. So that gives you the 6240 by 4160, which is essentially a 26 megapixel image, but it is the full sensor image. So this is what is so powerful about this particular camera, because what I'm going to do is show you actually the detail here between these two images. So these were both shot at ISO 800. I think it was 1/20th of a second. Yep, with my 35 millimeter f1.4 GM lens. And you'll notice over here on the left-hand side, I've got 66.7 set up for the magnification of this image, because I don't want to give the full 61 megapixel resolution, because then the Charlie Brown Christmas book is going to look a little bit larger in the frame as opposed to the one over here that's 26 megapixels. But you can see just by looking at these two images side by side that they are identical. I mean, there is no way that you'd be able to tell the difference. And this is zoomed in over here on the right hand side at 100%. So this is the full image, and you can see firsthand that there is absolutely no difference. Now, will there be situations where you're going to need that 61 megapixel image, I guess, if you're printing out on like a large format canvas or something like that. But the overwhelming majority of the time, it's going to be something that is on your computer for digital media. So you're really not going to need that 61 megapixels. Instead, you're just going to use this 26 megapixel image.
So it really is just incredible when you have that much resolution that you can use that APS-C mode, and the images are just spectacular. The other feature is the EVF. So the EVF in this is like on another level. I think it's the same EVF that's in the A1. Now I've used the A1 just in the camera store, but I've never owned an A1. But that really is the flagship camera. And when you see the difference between the EVF and the A7 IV versus the A7R5, the difference is huge.
This is the EVF on the A7R5. See how nice and big and bright that is. Don't mind the basement. It's winter time, it's supposed to be messy. Now we'll do the A7 IV EVF. Not as much detail in there. I don't know how well that comes across in the iPhone video, but in the real world, it's a pretty big difference. See how much smaller it is too.
Ultimately, you really do need to see the item in focus or the person in focus, and the A7 IV, just the resolution on the back of the screen and the resolution of the EVF was just not enough. Like you just really couldn't get critical focus. If you do use the EVF a lot, the upgrade from the A7 IV to the A7R5 is huge. All right, lastly, and this is a little bit more subtle, and this isn't something that's like make or break, but it is something to notice, is that on the A7R5, the white balance, the auto white balance seems to be much better than the A7 IV. The A7 IV is still fine. I mean, the A7 IV is better than previous generations of Sony cameras, but I did find that the colors still tended to be on the warmer side. This fixes that.
We are back in the now famous Charlie Brown Christmas scene here in the home office. What you'll notice is I've got the two images pulled up here. I've got the A7R5 on the left and I've got the A7 IV pulled up on the right. It looks like the A7 IV is underexposing, even though it's this exact same exposure. You can see here 1/20th of a second, f2.8, ISO 800. Again, the same lens, 35mm f1.4. You can see that right up here on the left-hand side for both images. It looks like this is just a little bit darker, and I'm not quite sure why that is. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that by 1/3 of a stop, just so we're comparing apples to apples. All right, now we've got the exposure essentially the same, and you'll notice that the A7 IV just has a little bit of yellow in it. So even though these two cameras, when you actually go into the develop module, they're both with auto white balance on, they both said that the image was 3200 degrees Kelvin for the white balance. They had a little bit different in the tint, but just in the image itself, you can see that there's just a hint of a yellow cast on this image on the A7 IV, as opposed to this A7R5, which looks like exactly the way that the scene looked to my eye. So just something to consider. The auto white balance in this scene really hasn't made a big difference, but it's a little bit of a difference. But in other scenes that I've taken, used auto white balance with the A7R5, it has done a much better job of being able to figure it out as opposed to the A7 IV.
Some of the things that are a little disappointing, but I knew it going into it. I mean, these are all things that I, of course, was aware of before I picked up this camera, was the no 4K 120. That is a little disappointing, but again, I have the FX3, so I can shoot in 4K 120 if I really need that. Most of the time I don't, but it is nice to have in those situations where you do. And the other thing that drives me absolutely bonkers, and this isn't specific to this camera, but it is all Sony cameras, is these stupid Type A memory cards that it takes. Nobody is supporting that format. They're slower than the Type B cards, and they cost a fortune. So can I go out and buy these cards? Yes. Will I? Absolutely not. I think they're stupid. I just don't know. I have no idea why Sony has adopted that format. Maybe somebody can let me know down in the comments as to why they've adopted that, but maybe it's proprietary and they own the rights to it. But anyways, those cards are ridiculously expensive for the capacity that you get, and there's really no reason for them. I put V90 cards in all of my Sony cameras, and those, I mean, even those are not inexpensive, but they're more flexible. You know, I could put them in a bunch of different devices as opposed to using the Type A cards, which can only be used in the Sony cameras. And then lastly, I want to talk about something that I've seen out there. A lot of people talk about is the rolling shutter, the bad performance of this particular camera, and I'm just not seeing that in real world situations. So I guess if you put it in a studio and you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, is it going to be a rolling shutter because it's a little bit slower readout? Sure, but I don't know. I mean, again, I'll go back to that track meet where I was filming my daughter in the long jump and on the track itself and some of the sprints. I think she did hurdles too, but you could see in the footage, I'm panning pretty quickly to keep up with her, and I don't see any diagonal or leaning lines, or it just doesn't feel like there's much of an issue there with rolling shutter. So I really think that that's something that is a little overblown in terms of cons for this particular camera, or for any camera for that matter, because the amount of times that you're gonna whip pan something is pretty small. Or if you are, then it's stylistic choice, I guess. And then you should definitely go out and get a camera that supports faster readout speed, so you don't have that rolling shutter. But for me and the work that I do and the stuff I'm doing, for my family and just in general use of this camera, it's perfectly fine. So to sum everything up, was this worth the $3,900 plus tax that it cost compared to the A7 IV, which could be had for $2,500? I think it is a resounding yes. Until Sony starts introducing this screen into the A7 IV lineup, which would be like the A7 V, I think you're crazy not to spend the extra money on something like this, because this is like the best of all worlds. You've got this incredible screen in the back, nice, bright, tons of detail. You've got this amazing EVF. You've got this 61 megapixel sensor that is available to you when you need it, but having the ability to shoot in RAW at 26 megapixels, which is more than enough for most people, is great. In addition to that, the build quality is fantastic. Full-size HDMI, again, a lot of things that it shared with the A7 IV, because it does share essentially the same body. But overall, I think it is and the stabilization, again, is great in this camera as opposed to the A7 IV, which isn't bad, but this is that much better, especially with the right lens on there. So again, is it worth it? To me, it certainly was, and it may be to you as well, but I can't make that decision for you. You have to decide what your priorities are. If you enjoyed this content, I just kindly ask that you smash the like button and also click the subscribe button down below to be notified of future videos. Thanks for watching. Take care.